Whispers tore through town like wildfire. Abigail stood humiliated, tears stinging her eyes. Vultures circled her husband's grave, mocking her weight, demanding her land. Nobody wants a fat widow. Hiram spat. Suddenly, massive boots shook wooden floorboards. A towering, scarred mountain man stepped forward, growling, "I do." The August sun beat down on the dusty streets of Oak Haven, Colorado, baking the wooden sidewalks and drawing out the sour smells of cheap whiskey and horse sweat. It was the summer of 1881, a brutal year for anyone trying to carve a life out of the unforgiving western frontier. On the raised wooden porch of the Mercer General Store, Abigail Mercer stood entirely alone, though she was surrounded by nearly every soul in town. Abigail was a woman of generous proportions, possessing a soft, full figure that the harsh, bitter women of Oak Haven loved to whisper about. In a land where starvation and endless toil whittled folks down to bone and sinew, Abigail's plumpness was viewed not as a sign of health, but as a wicked indulgence. Her husband, Thomas Mercer, had been dead barely a fortnight, his broken body found at the bottom of a rocky ravine near Dead Man's Peak. Now, before the dirt on his grave had even settled, the vultures had descended. Standing opposite Abigail was Hiram Cobb, the town's wealthiest landowner and proprietor of the local bank, alongside Amos Mercer, Thomas's younger, rat-faced brother. "The law is clear, Mrs. Mercer," Hiram announced, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. He hooked his thumbs into his silk vest, his gold pocket watch chain gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Thomas owed the bank upwards of $2,000. With him gone, the deed to this store and the 300 acres of timberland out west defaults to the bank, unless, of course, you can pay. Abigail clutched her black mourning shawl tighter around her ample shoulders. Her knuckles were white. "You know I do not have that kind of money, mister." "Cobb," she said, her voice trembling, but her chin held high. Thomas kept the books. "He never told me we were in such debt." "A woman's place ain't to worry about ledgers," Amos sneered, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt. "But fact remains, Abby, you can't run this place. You ain't built for hard labor. Look at you. You're soft. You've been eating up all of Thomas's profits while he worked himself into an early grave." A few cruel chuckles rippled through the crowd. Prudence Gable, the town gossip, hid a wicked smile behind her fan. Abigail felt a hot flush of deep humiliation creep up her neck. She had loved Thomas in a quiet, dutiful way, and she had worked just as hard as him, hauling sacks of flour, scrubbing floors, and managing the entire inventory of the mercantile. But to these people, her size made her an easy target, a joke. "I am proposing a solution," Amos continued, stepping forward to address the crowd. "I will assume my brother's debts. In exchange, I take the store and the timber claim. As for Abigail, she can take the stagecoach back east to her spinster sisters in Boston. It's the Christian thing to do." "I am not leaving my home, Amos," Abigail cried out, a sudden fire igniting in her chest. "This is my store. I built it with him." "Be reasonable, woman," Hiram Cobb snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Who is going to help you? You have no family here, no man to stand for you. And, let's be brutally honest, Abigail, who is going to take you on? You require a husband to hold this deed under the territory laws, and we both know the reality of your situation." Hiram turned to the laughing crowd, his voice rising into a cruel, theatrical shout. "Look around. Nobody wants a fat widow." The laughter was no longer hidden. It was loud, jeering, and mean. Abigail closed her eyes, the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilling over her lashes. She felt entirely broken, stripped of her dignity in the public square. Then, the laughter stopped. It didn't fade. It was cut dead, replaced by a sudden, suffocating silence. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of heavy, iron-spurred boots striking the wooden boardwalk echoed like gunshots. The crowd parted, as if Moses himself had commanded the Red Sea. Men stepped back, pulling their wives behind them. Stepping out of the dusty haze was a giant of a man. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall, shoulders as broad as a barn door, draped in a heavy elk-hide coat despite the summer heat. A Winchester .73 repeating rifle was slung casually over his back, and a massive Bowie knife rested on his thigh. but it was his face that made mothers cover their children's eyes. The left side of his face was a tapestry of violent, raised, pink scars, the unmistakable handiwork of a grizzly bear. The beast's claws had torn from his forehead down to his jaw, leaving his left eye a milky, sightless white. His good right eye, however, was a piercing, icy blue, and it was fixed dead on Hiram Cobb. It was Jedediah Rust. The townsfolk called him Grizzly Jed. He was a solitary mountain man, a trapper who lived near the treacherous summit of Dead Man's Peak. He only came down twice a year for supplies, and men crossed the street to avoid his shadow. Jedediah stopped at the base of the porch. He looked up at Abigail, his gaze lingering on her tear-stained face, taking in her full, trembling figure. There was no mockery in his surviving eye, only a strange, intense heat. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a swollen leather saddlebag. With a flick of his massive wrist, he tossed it onto the wooden barrel next to Hiram. It hit with a heavy, metallic clank that made the banker jump. "Weigh it." Jedediah's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. Ezekiel Cross, the town assayer who was standing nearby, nervously stepped forward. He untied the leather straps. His eyes went wide. "Lord Almighty," Ezekiel breathed, "it's pure gold. Placer, nuggets, and dust. There's gotta be $4,000 here." The crowd gasped. Amos Mercer turned pale. "That pays Thomas's debt," Jedediah growled, his eye never leaving Hiram, "and it buys the deed, free and clear." "Now see here, Rust," Hiram stammered, trying to regain his composure. "You can't just buy a man's debt. The law says she needs a husband to hold the property rights in this county, unless she's an established homesteader. You're just a trapper." Jedediah slowly turned his massive, scarred head toward Hiram. The menace in his posture was palpable. He took one slow step up the stairs, towering over the banker. "Then read the banns, Cobb," Jedediah growled, his deep voice carrying over the dead silent town. He reached out his large, calloused hand toward Abigail. She stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I do," Jedediah stated, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying finality. "I'm taking her as my wife." The courthouse wedding was a blur of ink, sweat, and terror. Judge Miller, trembling under Jedediah's steely glare, rushed through the vows in less than 5 minutes. Abigail's voice had been a barely audible whisper when she said "I do," while Jedediah's response was a low, rumbling vow that seemed to shake the dust from the courthouse rafters. By noon, she was strapped onto the back of a sturdy gray mule, leaving the only home she had known for the past 5 years. The ride up to Dead Man's Peak was grueling. As they ascended, the familiar oaks and cottonwoods of the valley gave way to towering, ancient blue spruce and quaking aspens. The air grew thin, crisp, and bitingly cold, even in August. Abigail clung to the saddle horn, her thighs aching, her breath coming in short, exhausted gasps. She was acutely aware of her weight, of the strain she must be putting on the poor animal beneath her, and the shame of the morning's event still burned hot in her cheeks. Jedediah rode ahead of her on a massive black draft horse, his posture rigid and alert. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left the town limits. Abigail's mind raced with dark, terrifying thoughts. Why had this monstrous, legendary man paid a king's ransom for her? The townsfolk had called her fat, useless, a burden. Did he buy her to be a beast of burden, a slave for his cabin? Or worse, was he a madman who preyed on discarded women? As the sun began to dip behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the timberline, a structure emerged from the dense pines. It was a cabin, but not the rotting, squalid hovel Abigail had pictured. It was large, expertly crafted from thick, peeled logs, with a tight cedar-shake roof and a sturdy stone chimney puffing fragrant gray wood smoke into the twilight sky. Jedediah dismounted effortlessly and walked back to her mule. He reached up, his massive hands spanning her waist. Abigail flinched, closing her eyes tightly, expecting him to drag her down roughly. Instead, his grip was incredibly firm but surprisingly gentle. He lifted her from the saddle as if she weighed no more than a sack of goose feathers, setting her softly on the ground. "Legs'll be unsteady," he rumbled softly, keeping one hand on her arm until she found her balance. Abigail opened her eyes, looking up at his ruined face. Up close, the scars were even more fearsome, rugged and twisted, yet she noticed that his blue eye was clear, framed by thick, dark lashes. "Come inside. Wind's getting sharp," he said, turning to lead the horses to a well-built lean-to. Abigail stepped into the cabin and stopped dead in her tracks. The interior was spotless. A massive bear rug dominated the floor before a roaring hearth. Cast-iron pans hung in neat rows above a clean wood stove. Books. Dozens of leather-bound books lined a shelf against the far wall. The scent of dried sage, cured tobacco, and roasting coffee beans filled the air. It was a home. When Jedediah entered a few minutes later, he barred the heavy oak door and shrugged off his coat. He walked over to the stove and poured 2 tin cups of black coffee, setting one on the sturdy wooden table in front of her. Abigail sat down, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't pick up the cup. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, she broke it. "Why?" Her voice cracked, sounding small and pathetic to her own ears. "Why did you do this? Why spend your gold on me?" She gestured helplessly to her full figure, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You heard them. I am a fat widow. I am not a prize. I cannot plow your fields, and I know I am not what men desire." Jedediah stopped stoking the fire. He set the iron poker down slowly. He turned to her, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. He walked over and pulled up a chair, sitting opposite her. "Them folks down in Oakhaven are fools," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a low, intense timbre. "They look at a woman who survived 5 years on this frontier, a woman who kept a business running while her husband was off chasing fool's gold, and they see weakness. I see a survivor." He paused, his blue eye dropping to the curves of her waist and the fullness of her chest before meeting her eyes again, entirely unashamed. "And for the record, Abigail, I find no fault in how the good Lord made you. A man needs a woman with substance, not a stiff wind's plaything." Abigail gasped, a profound blush coloring her face, but there was a strange, warm flutter in her chest. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not even Thomas. "But that ain't why I came down the mountain," Jedediah continued, the softness vanishing from his voice, replaced by cold steel. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy object, placing it gently on the table between them. Abigail let out a choked sob. It was a silver pocket watch, heavily dented, with the initials T.M. engraved on the lid. It was Thomas's watch. "I told the sheriff I found your husband at the bottom of the ravine," Jedediah said grimly. "I didn't tell him what I found up top." "What? What do you mean?" Abigail whispered, her blood running cold. Jedediah leaned forward, the firelight dancing in his milky white eye. "Thomas didn't fall, Abby. I found signs of a struggle near the ridge. 2 sets of boot prints. And I found a casing from a .44 caliber revolver. Thomas was shot in the back and pushed." Abigail clutched her chest, the room spinning around her. "Murdered? But who? Why?" "A few weeks back, Thomas stumbled onto my land," Jedediah explained. He was frantic. "Said he'd found a massive vein of silver in the old timber claim out west, the land Amos and Hiram were trying to steal from you today. He told them about it before he filed the official claim in Denver. He made a fatal mistake." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Amos and Hiram. They killed him for the silver. "Yes," Jedediah nodded. "And you were next. If you hadn't sold that land to them today, they wouldn't have let you leave Oakhaven alive. Or they would have forced you onto a stagecoach that would conveniently get robbed on the way to Boston. I've read reports from Pinkerton agent Nathaniel Reed. Men like Cobb don't leave loose ends." Abigail stared at the scarred mountain man, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He hadn't bought her to be a slave. He hadn't bought her out of some twisted desire. "You bought the deed to protect the land," she whispered. "You married me to protect me." Jedediah's jaw tightened. "I owed Thomas. He pulled me out of a blizzard 3 years ago. I pay my debts." He stood up, towering over the table once more. "You take the bed, Abigail. I'll sleep by the fire." Tomorrow, we start planning on how to bring Hiram Cobb and Amos Mercer to the hangman's noose. Frost crept across the heavy glass window panes as weeks turned into a harsh, unforgiving Colorado autumn. Up on Dead Man's Peak, Abigail discovered a rhythm of life she had never thought possible. Far from being a captive or a servant, she found herself treated as an absolute equal. Jedediah did not view her like a fragile, broken porcelain doll, nor did he mock her softer edges. Instead, he nurtured a fierce independence within her. Mornings began before dawn, not with insults, but with the rich aroma of roasted coffee and sizzling venison. Jedediah taught her how to hold his heavy Winchester 73 repeating rifle, wrapping his massive, scarred hands over hers to steady the barrel against the brutal mountain winds. He taught her how to track game in the early snow, and how to read the changing weather rolling off the Continental Divide. With every passing day, Abigail's grief over Thomas's betrayal and death hardened into a cold, determined steel. Her body, once a source of deep shame in the unforgiving eyes of Oak Haven's gossips, proved to be her greatest asset. Her natural strength allowed her to haul firewood and pack meat without collapsing, and her curves kept the bitter mountain cold at bay. More importantly, she saw how Jedediah looked at her. Late one evening, as the wind howled like a wounded beast against the log walls, Abigail stood by the hearth, brushing out her long chestnut hair. Jedediah sat by the table, cleaning his revolver. She caught his blue eye lingering heavily on the swell of her hips and the soft curve of her waist. "You stare at me," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackling fire. Jedediah paused, laying the oiled rag down. He rose from his chair, his towering frame casting a dark, protective shadow over her. He stepped close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. Slowly, he reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing her jawline, avoiding the side of his face torn by the grizzly. "I stare because I am a starving man looking at a feast," Jedediah rumbled, his voice a low, vibrating growl that sent shivers down her spine. "I spent 10 years alone on this rock, Abigail. I forgot what beauty looked like until you stood on that auction block, fighting off wolves with nothing but your pride. You are a magnificent woman, every inch of you." Tears pricked her eyes, but this time they were tears of profound relief. She leaned into his touch, her soft hands reaching up to cup his scarred, ruined cheek. He closed his good eye, leaning into her warmth like a man finding religion. That night, the marriage they had forged in a dusty courthouse became a true union of flesh and spirit, filled with a desperate, burning passion that rivaled the roaring fire beside them. But the mountain's peace was an illusion. Down in the valley, desperate men were running out of time. 2 nights later, the hounds began to bark furiously, their hackles raised toward the western tree line. Jedediah rolled out of bed instantly, grabbing his Winchester. "Get down!" he hissed, throwing a heavy wool blanket over Abigail. "Stay below the window frame." Glass shattered violently as a volley of bullets tore through the cabin, showering the floor with deadly splinters. Abigail crawled toward the heavy iron stove, grabbing a loaded, double-barreled shotgun Jedediah had left for her. "Rust!" a voice hollered from the dark pines. "Send the fat widow out, and we might let you keep your scalp. Cobb wants his deed." Jedediah's face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. He kicked open the heavy oak door and dove onto the porch, firing 3 rapid shots into the darkness. A man screamed in agony. Abigail didn't hide. The fire in her blood ignited. She crawled to the shattered window, leveling the heavy shotgun over the sill. In the pale moonlight, she saw a shadowy figure creeping up the side of the porch, raising a revolver aimed directly at Jedediah's exposed back. She pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her shoulder, but the deafening blast caught the ambushers entirely off guard. The man aiming at Jedediah was thrown backward into the snow, screaming as buckshot peppered his legs. Jedediah spun around, seeing what she had done, and gave her a grim, approving nod. Within minutes, the mountain man had hunted down the remaining 2 thugs in the snowdrifts, dragging them back to the cabin by their collars. One was dead. The other, bleeding profusely from his leg, was a notorious hired gun named Cole. Jedediah slammed Cole into the wooden chair, pressing the edge of his massive bowie knife against the outlaw's throat. "Talk," Jedediah growled, "or I feed you to the wolves piece by piece." All right, Lord Almighty, all right, Cole spat blood onto the floorboards. Amos Mercer paid us, said his brother's widow was holding a deed to a silver vein worth $50,000. He and Cobb hired us to burn you out and make it look like a tragic accident. They already signed a contract with a mining conglomerate in Denver. They need you dead by Monday to finalize the sale. Abigail stepped forward, her nightgown stained with soot, the shotgun resting casually on her hip. She looked down at the terrified outlaw, then over to her husband. Monday, she repeated softly, a dangerous smile touching her lips. Then we had better not keep them waiting. Hooves thundered down the mountain trail as Sunday morning broke over the valley. Abigail rode tall on her gray mule, no longer the weeping, humiliated victim who had been dragged up the peak. She wore a tailored wool riding habit, her chin held high, the cold wind whipping her hair behind her. Beside her rode Jedediah, looking like an ancient god of war, and behind them, bound tightly to his saddle, was the bleeding, terrified Cole. But they were not riding into Oak Haven alone. Following a telegraph sent from a neighboring mountain settlement 2 weeks prior, a third rider had joined them at the valley crossroads. He was a sharply dressed man with a bowler hat and a severe, calculating gaze. It was Charles Siringo, a legendary operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency out of Chicago. Siringo had been investigating Hiram Cobb's banking practices for months, suspecting massive fraud across the territory. Thomas Mercer's murder was the missing piece to a grand, bloody puzzle. The town of Oak Haven was quiet as the church bells rang for morning service. The congregation was just spilling out onto the muddy main street when the three riders, pulling a bloody captive, halted in front of the bank. Hiram Cobb and Amos Mercer stood on the boardwalk, their smug faces draining of all color as they saw who was leading the posse. "Morning, Hiram," Abigail called out, her voice ringing clear and steady over the stunned murmurs of the townsfolk. "I understand you've been looking for me." "Sheriff," Hiram barked, his voice cracking with panic. "Sheriff! Arrest that man! Rust is a savage! He's assaulted my employee!" The local sheriff stepped forward, his hand on his revolver, but hesitated as Charles Siringo swung down from his horse and flipped open his leather credential wallet, revealing a gleaming silver Pinkerton star. "Federal jurisdiction, Sheriff," Siringo announced sharply. He reached into his coat and produced a thick stack of telegrams and ledgers. "Hiram Cobb, you and Amos Mercer are under arrest for the murder of Thomas Mercer, conspiracy to commit murder against Abigail Mercer, and federal bank fraud. We have the confession of your hired gun right here, along with the forged deeds." Amos panicked. Like a cornered rat, he drew his pistol, aiming frantically at Abigail. Before Amos could even cock the hammer, Jedediah's Winchester cracked like a lightning bolt. The bullet shattered Amos's wrist, sending his gun flying into the dirt. Amos collapsed, howling in pain, cradling his mangled arm. Jedediah dismounted slowly, his heavy boots echoing on the boardwalk just as they had on the day of the auction. The townspeople shrank back in awe and terror. He walked right up to Hiram Cobb, picking the wealthy banker up by the lapels of his expensive silk vest, lifting his polished shoes entirely off the ground. "Nobody wants a fat widow, you said," Jedediah whispered, his voice dark and deadly. He tossed Hiram violently into the mud at Siringo's feet. "You underestimate her, Cobb, and that just cost you your life." The town watched in stunned silence as Siringo slapped heavy iron cuffs on both Hiram and Amos. Prudence Gable, the town gossip who had mocked Abigail just weeks before, stared at the transformed woman on the mule with her jaw hanging open. Abigail looked down at the people who had abandoned her. She felt no anger anymore, only pity. She was the sole owner of the richest silver strike in Colorado, but as she looked over at the towering, scarred mountain man who had walked through hellfire for her, she knew where her true wealth lay. "Jedediah," she said softly, reaching her hand out to him. He took it, his fierce eye softening as he looked up at his wife. "Take me home," she smiled. "We have a cabin to repair." Together, they turned their horses away from the corrupt, petty town, riding back toward the clouds, back to the wild, untamed mountain where they belonged. Did you love seeing Abigail and Jedediah get their frontier justice? If this twisted tale of betrayal, romance, and revenge kept you hooked, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow story lovers and hit subscribe so you never miss another wild ride into the Western frontier. Drop a comment below. Would you have survived Dead Man's Peak? Let us know.